Today we are talking about a concept that is rarely associated with your work, the unconscious.
Hmm. Of course, I did some research into the history of psychoanalysis. That came sort of naturally when I was investigating the emergence and evolution of the humanities.
But psychoanalysis is not a human science, at least not in the way in that linguistics or historiography belong to the humanities.
Well, psychoanalysis, like linguistics, has to do with language. And just as historiography, also with interpretation. But it is not simply and so to speak naively attached to the image or the figure of the human. One could say it follows the same paths as the traditional humanities, but with its gaze turned the other way. It moves toward that sphere where the contents of consciousness articulate themselves, or rather stand gaping upon man's finitude.
It approaches the unconscious,
Yes, that dimension in which the human no longer plays an overriding role.
where man disappears like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea.
Well, if you really mean it, then yes. But I was also interested in the unconscious myself.
You mean independently of your interest in Freud, Lacan, and Binswanger?
Well, perhaps not independently of all these readings, but still in my own specific way.
Tell me.
Well, you find traces of it in a rather prominent place in the foreword to the Order of Things, where I talk about the history of science, because that's basically the area of research in which I've done most of my work. What I wanted to achieve in that book was to reveal a positive unconscious of knowledge, a level that eludes the consciousness of the scientist and yet is part of scientific discourse.
The unconscious of science? You mean the slips of the tongue and the mistakes of researchers, their childhood traumas, and their sexual fantasies?
No, no, that would be thinking very much like Freud. That would be the negative unconscious of science.
But you weren't interested in that.
Exactly. Basically, in all my work, I explore the following idea. The history of science, the history of knowledge, does not simply obey the general law of the progress of reason. Human consciousness or human reason are not, as it were, the owners of the laws of their history. Below what science knows about itself, there is something that it does not know. Its history, its becoming, its episodes and coincidences obey a series of laws and determining factors. I've tried to determine these laws and factors.
Now I understand. Below what science knows about itself. That's why you're talking about archaeology and discourse analysis, of course.
I've tried to define an autonomous realm that represents the unconscious of knowledge, which has its own rules, just as the unconscious of the human individual has its own rules and determining factors.
In other words, the order of discourse, that is, the way in which people speak and must speak in a given society or culture, not only in public on the streets, but also and perhaps above all in the laboratories of physics, biology, and chemistry.
Yes, because when you analyze human language, you will not discover the nature, the essence, or the freedom of man. Instead, one discovers unconscious structures that dominate us without us realizing or wanting to, and without ever speaking of our freedom or our consciousness. And these structures decide the fate within whose framework we speak.
So, a kind of linguistic unconscious?
Oh, that sounds much too Lacanian. Perhaps more of a discursive unconscious, or the unconscious of our culture? My problem is essentially the definition of the implicit systems in which we find ourselves prisoners. What I would like to grasp is the system of limits and exclusion which we practice without knowing it. I would like to make the cultural unconscious apparent.
I see. So, you really have something to say about the concept of the unconscious. Thank you.
Hey! Uh, did you just mention the unconscious? Uh, Without me, you wouldn't even be able to talk about it.